My fellow Americans, many of you may not know who I am, but that is of no importance. I am simply an American, and also simply a vessel for ideas that are greater than not only me, but every single one of you watching this video. But those are the ideas that actually set our country into motion and inspire, which is perhaps the greatest experiment in human freedom and individual self-governance that this world has ever seen. And yet, my friends, this experiment is under threat in our current era. It's been under threat for a very long time, and it has evolved and also grown scales to beat back other threats throughout our history. We beat back Nazi Germany in the World War II. We beat back the siren calls of authoritarianism at various parts of our history. We beat back, perhaps most notably and most canonically, the attempt for King George in the British Empire to keep us serfs beneath an old world order. And so as a country that is resilient, many challenges throughout our history are simply second nature to us. But unfortunately, my friends, the new world has brought new challenges. And America is facing a range of new challenges that unfortunately are weighing it down and could potentially result in its destruction. Among those challenges are a rapidly globalizing world in which the American worker is not valued whatsoever, and they are simply treated as a commodity to aid the GDP of another country that may be on our ally list that we decided we have an obligation to. One of those, of course, troubles that we're facing are the endless wars that politicians in both parties tend to get us into perpetually, and that the current president, Joe Biden, has us enshrined in right now. But of these many threats, I can't think of one that is perhaps more prescient than the kind of culture that we have in American politics that produced the State of the Union tonight that was delivered by President Joe Biden. Indeed, in the founding generation, if a president had gone up at a podium and threatened to take away the inalienable rights of citizens to defend themselves, that would have itself been cause for a riot or some kind of upheaval. If in the founding generation, half of the stuff that we witnessed in tonight's State of the Union speech would have been said or would have happened, that would have been perhaps a fulfillment of Jefferson's principle enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, that when a government becomes injurious to the harmonious ends that it was constituted to fulfill, it should be reformed or abolished. Indeed, my friends, Joe Biden's State of the Union speech really does reflect the state of our union in many different ways. And in all those ways, it demonstrates it to, unfortunately, be weak. For example, in Joe Biden's speech, for the first, perhaps half of it, the first 10 to 15 minutes, he did several things that would have boggled the minds of any decent person in attendance. He lied about the former president and said the former president proclaimed that Russia should be able to just steamroll NATO countries, when in all reality, the former president said that if NATO countries will not pay their fair share, speaking of a loaded term, and they will not contribute to their own defense, and they will instead try to reap from the American people's pockets, they will not enjoy the protection of a mutual alliance. Because at that point, there is no mutual alliance. There is simply a parasitic alliance. Indeed, Joe Biden also said numerous things that were also factually incorrect. For example, he called January 6th a dark and fateful day, when in all reality, while there were certainly rowdiness that happened that day, what is even more dark and fateful are the fates of those who didn't even partake in violence, who are being held in gulags, who are being treated like terrorists, and many of whom were overcharged by the justice system, all to fulfill some vain sense of benevolence on behalf of the current power structure in charge. That is not only a disgrace against any American, that is a deviation in the form of sound government that our founders expected would lead this country to great heights. It is a deviation of the highest order. Not only that, but Joe Biden also stunningly threatened the Supreme Court by saying that women will make their voice heard due to the court striking down Roe v. Wade. The last president to threaten the Supreme Court was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who Joe Biden actually cited at the beginning of his speech. FDR, let me tell you about him. FDR, his intention was to pack the courts with justices sympathetic to his worldview, in defiance of first principles, in defiance of the restraints of the Constitution, all to ensure his agenda was rubber stamped. That was most certainly a threat to the court's integrity, not as brazen as the threat that Joe Biden laid out tonight. But it is obvious to me that Joe Biden is indeed following in the footsteps of his old progressive forefathers. That's not unifying. That is not, as Biden likes to say a lot, reviving the soul of America. That's tearing apart not only the soul of America, but the character of America and everything that America stands for. But in the tradition, my fellow Americans, that Joe Biden actually walks in, it makes perfect sense. Progressivism, which is simply one form of malignant leftism, has been redefining our history, our culture, our Constitution, and our moral framework in this country for over 130 plus years. And they have been doing so all by wrapping up their initiatives and goals in the language of being a good person, which then assumes that if you oppose their initiatives and goals, you are a bad person. We saw a little bit of this tonight as well in Joe Biden's speech, where in his speech, he talked about his educational initiative, and he looked at everyone and said, you wouldn't want a child to go without education, would you? Well, of course, most decent people wouldn't. But this is the flawed premise the progressives use to trick you into their worldview, because they present a false situation, a false dilemma, if you will humor me for a moment, and they will say it is either this way or the other way without including or considering a third alternative. It's manipulation, it's dishonest, and we saw it on full display tonight during the State of the Union. One of the more egregious moments from the speech tonight was when Joe Biden actually refused to call upon the name of Lincoln Riley, the innocent young girl who was killed by someone who should not have been in the country at the time they committed the crime. And he only called upon her when urged to by a person in the crowd. He held up a locket and then, in front of her parents, who were in the balcony adjacent to Biden, couldn't even say her name correctly. My friends, the State of the Union, as evidenced by this speech, is evidently poor. It doesn't have to be this way, though. But it is this way. And we should ask ourselves, what is the culture that produced a leader like Joe Biden? And not only that, but allows him to hold on to a shred of legitimacy despite the antagonisms, despite the lies, despite the distortions, and quite frankly, despite the grievous offenses he has committed against the American people in so many cases, whether it be attempting to infringe upon their medical freedom by forcing them through occupational safety rules to take a medicine they may not agree with, whether it be by limiting their economic buying power through economic authoritarianism known as sanctions, and then villainizing Russia, and by villainizing Russia and sanctioning them, causing inflation to go up, and therefore depriving Americans of their buying power, whether it be saying that NATO and Ukraine need our support when we're suffering here at home. What in the world, what kind of culture has produced this menace? That's perhaps a bigger question than the time I have to you tonight to talk about that. But it is a question indeed that should be in the back of your minds as I discuss this. Americans, my friends, we live in a country right now where, as I mentioned, your buying power goes much less than it did even 30, 40 years ago. We live in a country right now where our government seems more concerned about what is happening halfway across the world than what is actually happening right now. We live in a country right now where our political culture, and this is deep, hear me, is more worried about elections, more worried about unchecked norms than they are about moral soundness and philosophical consistency. Indeed, you'll always hear many political observers talk about winning, but they always mean winning races, which treats politics as a game. But when a single mother is struggling to put food on her table because there are sanctions passed down by hoity-toity bureaucrats that think that they can run her buying habits in her life better than she can, that's not a game. That's an emergent reality that must be faced and dealt with in the best way possible. When we have bloodshed happening around the world, it is not generous. It is not good. It is not wise to spend the money of Americans on perpetuating that bloodshed. When we have a southern border, which, by the way, did not get much of a mention in Biden's speech, that is wide open, and people of all sorts, those many of whom we can't even verify or know, are pouring in, and it's causing bottleneck crises across the country, we don't have a good situation. When we have a ruling class that operates largely by the same principles, and that is in full rebellion against the Constitution, and has created this system of propaganda in empty terms to govern the minds of Americans and enslave it to mediocrity, we are not in a good situation. My friends, the State of the Union is poor, not just because of Joe Biden, although he is an accelerant to our decline, but because we as Americans have lost our way and our ability to check authority, number one, to do so rationally and soundly, number two, and to remember what we as a country were created for. We as a country were not created to be the world's policemen. We were created instead to have strong borders to defend ourselves, and in those rare cases where our friends do get in trouble, make considered America first, grounded calculations on if we get involved, if at all. We weren't a country meant to have a mass surveillance state where every single thing you do or say is monitored in some way, shape, or form, if not by the government explicitly, by the government's proxies in Google and Yahoo and all these other places, Facebook, Meta now. We were meant to be a place where you were secure in your papers and possessions as said in the Constitution. We weren't meant to be a nation where the government tells you what to eat, what to do, what to put in your body, or when or how you can worship, as Democratic governors did during the COVID pandemic when they seized churches, arrested parishioners for deciding to worship their God, for deciding to put their eyes towards the transcendent as opposed to the material, as leftism is so keen on having us focus on the material. We were meant to be a country where, in the backdrop of the old world Europe, which was torn between religious factions, Protestant and Catholic, that were in the governments of those countries, that imposed their view of God upon people by force, we were meant to be a country where religious liberty was not only accepted, but a necessary condition for a good society. And yet everything I'm saying right now, and I can go on and on and on and on, has been forgotten by many of us. Because many of us don't see America as it should be. We see America as it has been portrayed to us through the media, as it has been portrayed to us through politicians that take cues from the media, as it has been portrayed to us by the current mediocre culture of the mind that infects our country. It was Samuel Adams that said, the domestic troubles, and I'm paraphrasing, but the domestic troubles of our nation will be greater than any foreign adversary. And he was absolutely correct. And from Sam Adams, someone who was quite influential in our founding, we should take that very seriously. If Americans forget what it means to be an American, if we forget what it means to have our kind of country, if we forget the duties, not just what it means, but the duties bequeathed upon us as Americans to preserve that intellectual tradition that we all inherit, then my friends, we will lose our country as we have been for the past 60 or 70 years. And Joe Biden, as I mentioned earlier in my speech about this culture that produced him, is simply a symptom of that culture. He is not the source. The solution, my friends, is not going to be just voting for people. It is true that President Trump, who Biden referred to as the predecessor, it is absolutely true that under President Trump, there were no new wars. It is absolutely true that under President Trump, considerably, empirically, the boot of the government was lifted off of the neck of the consumer. Because for every regulation signed as per his executive order, 2 were repealed. It's absolutely true. Under President Trump, we upended the political order of mediocrity that shadowed our nation to a certain status for so long, and that opened the eyes of a lot of Americans. It's absolutely true that under President Trump, we demanded more from our allies, and we demanded that the geopolitical order serve us as Americans, and we don't serve it. It is absolutely true that under President Trump, we largely had peace around the world, and we were working towards peace in the Middle East. It is absolutely true that under President Trump, a lot of things were a lot better, and divisive ideologies like critical race theory or gender ideology, which try to reduce society to a bunch of power squabbles and then use that foul notion and indoctrinate the minds of both the youth and adults who are dumb enough to believe it. Probably not politically correct, but still, we have to be honest in these moments with that nonsense. It is absolutely true that those ideologies were driven out by President Trump's initiatives. So evidently, President Trump, without a doubt, was certainly a more impactful force positively in American culture than Biden. But a president nor a politician won't save us from our current cultural condition. Because our current cultural condition, which makes things like Biden's presidency possible, is actually a result, as I mentioned, of a deprivation of values. It's a result of a poverty of values. It's a result of a lack of moral education. It's a result of a lack of understanding of what it actually means to be an American. It's a result of a lack of economic understanding. It's a result of a lack of social understanding. It's a result of so many different things that are then accentuated and accelerated by the digital era. It's a result of fundamentally a loss of self and surrounding awareness that is so essential to succeed in life in general, and the American experiment especially requires for its survival. When Ben Franklin left the Constitutional Convention, someone asked him, "Sir, what do we have?" And he said, as is famously stated, "A republic, if you can keep it." The thing about a Republican system of government, a classical Republican system of government, based on the idea of res publica, is that it is a limited form of interaction with the public that requires a virtuous people in order to succeed. And virtue is not about being morally stuffy. It's not about being holier than thou. No, that's not virtue. That's conceit. And a lot of people that have conceit think they have virtue when they're really just confused people. Virtue is about recognizing what is right and wrong and pursuing those things in your everyday life with the consideration that your actions may inform the quality and character of the society that you live in. We have to get back to that in our country. And the best thing is, the white pill, as the kids say. You don't need a president or a politician or even a GOP, who I'm giving this response for, theoretically, to do this for you. You simply need your own self-awareness, your own willingness to push yourself, and the surety of your own conscience in order to begin what can and should be, and I believe, if you follow my advice, will be a revival of pure-blooded Americanism. My friends, the State of the Union is not strong, but it can be. And if we put our minds to it, it will be. But we must demand more from our culture, from ourselves, from our politicians, from our party officials. We must demand that the age of dryness and the age of impoverished thought and the age of emotionalism give way to the age of reason, give way to the age of rich values, give way to the age of spiritual thinking on both a moral level and a values-based level, and give way to an age of virtue. We must demand that our government far from being the authority that dictates our lives, becomes, as it was intended to be, the authority which simply defends us from those who would seek to dictate our lives to us. We must also go back to the idea that ultimately the responsibility for our lives and for our society rests on our shoulders and no one else. I believe if we do that, the State of the Union will not only be strong, it will be enduring. And it will last for another 270 plus years, so that more generations may eat the ripe fruit from that tree of liberty that Jefferson described in his famous words. My friends, thank you so much for listening, and may God bless these United States. That was unedited. There's no script for that. I did that all by myself. That is the kind of speech I wanted to see from the GOP in their response to Biden, but unfortunately that's not what happened. We got the speech from Miss Katie of Alabama, and I'm not disparaging her, but that speech did not give us what we needed. So if you guys want to help support me and my content, and you want to help bring my vision alive for this country, be sure to like, subscribe, share, do whatever you can to help me out. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.